Rightio, welcome to module number 4, environmental performance. In this section, module, I want to take you through methods of how we're going to go about managing our project, or as I suppose it's applicable for any situation, but specifically in a contractual arrangement, and how we go about optimizing that construction or that project and getting the most amount of environmental performance, the highest level of performance that we can in that whole process. The majority of this, I suppose, primarily because of my background being in construction, in civil construction, I will be focusing on that contractual arrangement within that civil construction environment itself. So to start with, we've got a situation where you've gone through and you've acquired your approvals, you've done your EIS, and that's been approved. You've now gone ahead, worked with your project team, you're in the project management team, you've gone to tender and you've engaged a contractor, and you've now that contractor has been awarded, and you've gone out onto site and you're actually commencing the project now. And so you're on schedule, you're on budget, everything's moving, it's all humming along, you're flat out, you can't keep up with it all, and that's real life. And there's just one major issue in there, is that you're not hitting your performance levels, not hitting your KPIs, you're not getting the performance, the environmental performance that you need to be getting. You've got obligations. If you were involved in that earlier phase of going and talking with stakeholders, you would have been making commitments. And what you're seeing on the ground is that these commitments that you've made prior to the project are not being met. So so what do? You've got issues. The teams don't care. They see you as an interruption to the process. Your management sees you as an interruption to the process. It's a cost. Whatever you come in and start saying, oh look, we're not meeting our requirements here. This isn't to spec. This is not compliant. So you're getting this feeling that you're an imposition. You're costing the project extra money. You're costing it extra time. What do you do? And so this whole section is about how you can hopefully primarily avoid this whole scenario. I've seen it several times, be it involved in it myself, and I've had to learn both the hard way and sort of go back and do it again. So this is critical, and this is really where the rubber hits the road as far as environmental management goes, and it's what blows my hair back. I really enjoy this style of it, and this area of environmental management, and I hope that throughout this process, some of my experience and my passion for this area rubs off, and that you can go ahead, apply some of these skills, and look at really getting the environmental performance that you want and that you need on your project. First of all, let's look at why we may want to be going on and looking for environmental performance. And there are lots of reasons. This is not a comprehensive list, but here are some obvious ones that we'll run through and look at why we're going to need environmental performance, or need to be getting the best performance we can from an environmental perspective. And initially, the ones that stand out could be compliance with your laws and regulations, license conditions, those sorts of things. You've gone ahead, you have a license to go and construct or build or go ahead with the project, but you will have conditions and you need to comply with them. If you don't comply, not only will you get fines, you will also be shut down, and generally the shutdown is far more expensive than any fine. If you look at just purely from that financial cost point of view, and there's other implications to getting fines or ending up in trouble. So compliance is a massive focus within this area to make sure you're hitting that compliance with the different obligations that you have. Certification, you may be operating to an ISO 14001 standard or other standards. You may have different requirements internally or externally. So you'll be looking at even within the market trying to prove and perform at a higher standard to the standard that those guys are performing over there. And that sort of goes a bit more into the next couple, which is your corporate social responsibility, where you've made promises, you have obligations with the community around you, with the regulators, and with all stakeholders around, and you need to be able to meet those obligations. And if you've made a promise, you want to keep that promise. And I can tell you from experience, it's very uncomfortable when you're standing knowing that a promise has been made and you can't seem to get that promise because of, and I'll go into all of those reasons later on, but you've got different people doing the work who have made those promises right out in the earlier phases. So that becomes awkward if you can't get that performance that you need to meet those promises. So this is one of the benefits of that, and also goes in with your reporting as well. If one of your obligations is to be reporting up to a regulator or a independent third party, then you need to be able to have good performance to report up. Your reputation is so important, and it becomes more and more important as we sort of move through this more modern age, I think, because particularly regulators will, in the approval process of the next project for that company, if you're with a company that is looking at doing not only this project but the next one and more in the future, they want to have a good reputation, so that it just makes that approvals process far easier. Right or wrong, someone who's assessing something, if they know the history of that company who's done it, they're going to either think, oh, these guys were rogues before, I'm really going to look hard now, or they're going to think, oh, these guys were outstanding before, let's have a look. And they look at it in a different light, and whether everyone operates in that manner. Without casting judgment, that's what happens. And it makes that approval process, even amendments, if you need to go and get an environmental authority amendment in that process, you will benefit greatly. If you're humming along and performing well, it makes that amendment process far easier. And the next point is shareholder investment or support. If you've got good performance, it's becoming on that global scale. Environmental performance is becoming just that much more important, and shareholders now, it starts ticking boxes. It starts making people pay attention. They want to be seen. Investors want to be seen as putting their money into companies and projects that are environmentally positive. And that's the world we're living in, which is a great thing. And it's also, your reputation. From my point of view, I want to set a standard. I want to go out there and I want to perform. I'm responsible for environment on this project, and when other people come in and have a look on this project, I want them to look at it and think, this is good. And so setting a standard, be it from your own personal point of view, from the company point of view, you want to be able to get performance. Sort of other, I suppose, the altruistic point of view. You want environmental performance because you want to be preventing that pollution, minimising your impacts. All other things aside, reputation, compliance, responsibility, etc. Ultimately, you want to be minimising your impacts and going through and conducting your operation with the least amount of impact to the surrounding environment, and that's what makes you go home feeling happy at the end of the day. And ultimately, good environmental performance being conducted well is going to be providing benefits to the project as well on that bottom line. So you're going to have efficiencies going there. If you've got some good systems that have been implemented, the whole process will be humming along. And that ultimately, if you're involved in that early phase and really investing good environmental management and environmental management processes within that early phase of the project, you can be offering a lot of financial gain and benefit as well. And a great example of that was just the other day when we went out and had a look at on our second field visit, and we had a look at the site where the enviros had been involved up early in the planning of the process, and along with the project manager, they looked at the site, they looked at it from an erosion and sediment control point of view, and they thought, if we go ahead and put where the waterway is going to be moved to, and we put that in up front, that waterway can become prior to the actual waterway being moved across, but the new channel that was dug, that can be used as a sediment basin for the life of the project. Then the rest of the project, well, they don't no longer need to go about building and modifying and changing the erosion sediment controls throughout the life of the project. They've put it there, it's the catch-all, and from now right through the end of the project, they've minimised their cost with regards to erosion and sediment control. And that's a great way of going about things, thinking forward and really providing a cost benefit. Contractual obligations from the contractor point of view. You want to be performing as best you can and meeting your KPIs and delivering what the spec actually asks for. That makes it easier to come back and win more work from that client if you're performing well. And it also helps you, I suppose, go back up to the reputation, also allows you to be able to go and win jobs with different clients based on your past performance. And ultimately, I suppose this goes right back up to the first point with regards to compliance, but ultimately it allows you to avoid penalties. So there's another cost saving there as well. And there are a whole heap of other reasons why we want to go about getting performance, good environmental performance. It's something that I enjoy doing, and I'm sure through going and applying some of these skills, you're going to enjoy doing it as well. So how are we going to go about getting that environmental performance that I've just spoken of? If we go back and we think about what we've done in the first module with environmental management systems, the underlying and the foundation of ISO 14001 is that whole continuous improvement process, that the plan, do, check, act, that applies very much here as well. And I'll give you a few little examples there. But if we want to get good environmental performance, and I suppose that's why this sits within ISO 14001. Ultimately, the plan, do, check, act, and ISO 9001. It's a proven system and it works. So in the planning phase, good planning is going to save a lot of money, and it's going to save a lot of heartache down the track. If you can go in to a project and do a strong risk assessment and base everything on that risk assessment ultimately, and plan ahead, look at the different issues that may come up and put measures in place to manage that, establish that really strong environmental specification, which allows, I suppose that's if you're sitting on the proponent's side, you can develop that strong environmental specification, and which enables you to really clearly and comprehensively explain the requirements to the prospective contractor. It allows them to then come back and give a far more accurate costing for that project, which then avoids the confusion that can occur down the track, and extra variations and the misunderstandings and the, oh, but we didn't include this into the bid, we didn't plan for this, we haven't priced for this. If you've got a solid and a really comprehensive, well thought out environmental specification, and you've got it all laid there, you give it makes it a far fairer situation. The contractor has a very solid base to prepare their tender on, and they're going to be able to price the thing comprehensively and far more accurately, and you're going to end up with ultimately a far better project. They're going to have the money there available to invest into good measures. It makes the good planning is absolutely fundamental, and I can't stress hard enough the requirement to get in there early in a project and really add value. And so then that planning phase adds that environmental specification and all of this environmental forethought, the risk assessments and that planning, adding that into the contract itself, giving contractors opportunity to scope it and plan it and price it. Then you're miles ahead. You should have far less issue with good performance. You should be able to almost expect good performance, or you should be able to expect it. The executing of the contract, if you've got a good contract there with your environmental specification, you can sit back and you can then apply some of the skills that we'll talk about later on in this video and in these slides, and simply roll the contract out, do as it says, execute the contract, and get the results that you want. The checking, regular inspection and monitoring, meetings, regularly meeting and discussing, maintaining a good relationship, but that checking is paramount, and we'll talk about several ways of going about doing that checking process. But you want to be involved regularly with that contractor, and if you're the contractor, being involved regularly with the client, or regularly it might or be the relationship between the regulator and the developer. But there's regular inspections, regular involvement goes an absolute long way to making sure both parties are on the same on the same playing field and the same frame of mind, and they're looking at thinking, yeah, this is what we want, this is not what we want, how can we go about resolving that? And then ultimately that they acting and looking at issues that may occur, and then we're also looking at the contract and applying the different measures and tools within that contract to go about getting that performance that we need, increasing or looking at changing habits, changing practices, implementing new measures to go about achieving those different standards, the KPIs, getting the results that we want to get. So if we were to expand a little bit more now in that how field and our planning, specifically our planning area, so the initial part of that good, effective contract management process, and I can't stress enough, I'll say it all the way through this video, is that the planning phase is where it makes or breaks a project. And I can give you a very, very good example of a project where I was involved in, and there was very, very little environmental planning that went into the initial phase. There was a very, very quick contract that had been thrown together. There wasn't an environmental specification. They only had a couple of references in there, very broad references to environmental management, and I came in almost as they were commencing work, and it was very difficult because there was very little to refer to. And as I'll go into later, all of our license conditions weren't included, or were arguably included into the contract process, and so there was very little. The contractor didn't have a lot of opportunity to price things in. The client expected the contractor to take on a whole heap of conditions, and expected them to have read them. They were available to them, but they, for whatever reason, hadn't read them, and life was very difficult. And to get the performance that we needed for simple compliance was a challenge through this whole process. So I want to really stress that involvement up front in a planning a contract is absolutely paramount. So the first the process that you're going to go through here is you want to assess risks. You want to go through and conduct an absolutely thorough and as comprehensive as you can risk assessment on this process. If you've got the opportunity, you might, and you've got people with a lot of experience on that project, you might want to run a lessons learned program to sit everyone down, and from all disciplines in the room, from engineering and construction, safety, from land management, environment, all different areas, and go through a lessons learned process and look at the risks that you may have coming up, and project risks and environmental risks, and put them up and go through and plan. How are we going to go about doing this? How have people dealt with it before? Because I can guarantee you there will be, because it'll be a new project team, you'll have people from different backgrounds. These people over here or person over here will have managed an issue in a certain way, and you'll have someone over on this side who will have managed the same problem in a totally different way. And you need to come up with a clear understanding of how you're going to go forward and what sort of result you want to get. So assess your risks to start with, and then as you're going through and writing up contract documentation, it may not just be the specification, but other documents within that contract. You want to be looking at specifying the standards that you want to be working to, and what level of compliance you're going to be getting, and what sort of obligations you have, what commitments have been made to the stakeholders and the public and regulators and the various different people around. And you need to have all of that documentation, all of that information documented and available to be provided to contractors, so that they can go through and plan and price through that process. And a critical thing in this, the whole thing, is establishing those KPIs, really clear, really relevant, really measurable KPIs. And for clarity, I'll talk about KPIs a little bit later on, but KPIs are performance indicators, and the word indicator is the important thing there, because that's exactly what they are. They are like a line in the sand. If we achieve above that, we are getting the performance that we want. If we are below that line in the sand, we're not getting the performance that we want. And that performance indicator is totally exclusive to, be it compliance levels. For example, let's think of water quality. That's an easy thing. Of water quality, you might have 50 milligrams, pick a figure, 50 milligrams per litre of suspended solids. There you go. Suspended solids sitting in solution. That's a clear figure. That's something you can shoot for, and you can measure and look at that water as it's being discharged, and you can test for it, and you can think, okay, we are hitting it, we're not. Okay, we're over, okay, we're not getting the performance that we want. We're under, we are getting the performance that we want. So, as I was saying before, they're exclusive to compliance levels, because you can set far tighter performance indicators than what you have as far as compliance, your compliance obligations or legal obligations go, and so that you know that you may exceed these KPIs over here, but you still haven't breached legislation or breached your conditions. So you can manage things. Setting those clear and measurable KPIs for that project allows you to go through and easily, be it from a contractor or a proponent's point of view, to go through on the project, look at certain aspects, assess them, and it avoids any conflict, because it's a measurable item. You want really clear KPIs so that there's no ambiguity. There's no sort of, oh yes, I think it is, no, I don't think it is. Set as measurable and definitive KPIs as you possibly can, and plan for that to avoid that conflict down the track. monitoring processes, and the frequency of meetings, and who's going to be present in those meetings, who's going to be present on walkthroughs or inspections and drive-throughs, those sorts of things. Specify all of those things. If you're necessary, you want to have a weekly inspection with that enviro or a superintendent or whoever you're going to have on site. If that's specified in that contract that you're going to have it at this time, that can more or less become a KPI of performance if you're doing those inspections. That's a lead indicator, and so you can use that. But establishing those, it avoids the whole issue of, too busy, I can't catch up this week or next week, or no one ever catch up, or all those sorts of things. You can, if you establish these things up front, you have set the platform, and you know what you need. You know what standard you're going to be working to for the rest of the project. Non-conformances, you will come across non-conformances all the way through the project, and not that you want to expect them, but they will be there because everyone's only human, and everyone's doing the best they can. But you need to have good, clear processes in place for the resolution of those non-conformances. People by nature will go through and try and do things as efficiently as they can, and if there's a corner to cut, they probably will, and so be prepared for that, and you want to have a non-adversarial approach to go about managing that, so that when you do come across a situation, you think, okay, this isn't to spec, hasn't hit the KPI, hasn't achieved what we need it to achieve, hasn't it's let us down on an obligation over there. How are you going to resolve that? And so you need to establish those things so that that process is very clear, documented, that both parties are very familiar with it and know, and it also helps. One of the hardest roles on any project, I believe, is the enviro sitting on the contractor's side, because by nature that enviro is working alongside their construction manager. And so that the construction manager has a focus of delivering on time, delivering it within the schedule and within the different quality parameters that she's got, and so you want to be able to, and the enviro, however, has got a different focus. Slightly, obviously, it shares those objectives, but also has the added focus on achieving environmental performance, and often achieving time frame and budget doesn't always meet with environmental performance, and so that's it. And so that enviro on the contractor side sits between the proponent, who, from their point of view, they want the best, and I'll often use the analogy of the proponent will want the gold-plated version, whereas the contractor really needs to deliver the galvanised version. And it's no good if they're delivering the old rusty steel version. You want the galvanised version, and that's sort of the middle road that needs to be met. It's fit for purpose. It's going to achieve and deliver what it's going to do. It doesn't have all the embellishments and the pretty bits necessarily, and it's not going to fall apart. Keeping in mind the enviro on the contractor side is going to be able to use a lot of this information as, I suppose, support to go back to the construction manager and say, construction manager, this is what we need to achieve. We priced for it. We promised we'd deliver it. It's here. It's in the spec. We need to be able to deliver this. And the construction manager, she's got, looks at it and think, fair enough. That's the way it is. That's the way we're going to do it. Incentivizing the process. We've had great success on some projects in specifying upfront what incentives were available if certain performance standards were met, and it worked really, really well. And I'll talk about our environmental issues register later on down the track, and going through and being able to go through and close out those items, get the performance that we wanted, made it very easy for the contractor. They could sort of more or less sail through, do what was requested. Incentive sat there waiting for them at the end. Happy days. It was good times. On the converse side of that, also specify the penalties. Is there a financial cost? Is there, will that scope of work be removed and then be it a back charge, or all of these other options that are available, and we're not going to go into what options are available, I suppose, in here. That's up to your contract manager within this process. They are the experts in that, and they're far more knowledgeable on it than I am. So to work with your contract manager or similar sort of person in doing that, and come up with incentives and penalties, specify them, and have them in that documentation. And it may not sit within your environmental spec. It might sit over there in other documents within the contract. And going on a little bit further from the penalty side of it, you also need to include in their termination provisions, so that if it goes down the pathway of just you're not getting performance at all and there's an issue, then you have an option to then move on, terminate, get someone else to do the work. And that's a difficult road to go down, but you need to have that option clearly set out. It makes it a lot easier, as opposed to if you haven't clearly articulated that, then you could very easily end up in a court or in an arbitration or that sort of a situation, having to deal with all of the issues that come about from that sort of a thing. And ultimately, plan to go through and have a constructive and a positive relationship with your counterpart, whichever side you're on. You want to be able to, performance management is ultimately, it's working with people. It's bringing the best out of people. It's not coming in like a policeman over the top and saying, I'm the boss, you're going to deliver this. That only makes people jack up and not want to work with you. So environment's one of those touchy areas. People are passionate about environment, as opposed to engineering can be a far less passionate area. It's just black and it's white. Is it this? Is it that? No, it's one or the other. But whereas environment, you'll find people are far more passionate about things. It's far more subjective, and so you really need to plan to be able to work with people through this process, knowing that people can get quite passionate and emotional about this subject. Good contract management. Ultimately, you want to aim towards a win-win scenario. That with both sides coming out at the end of the project, and you have got a win-win on both sides, and that is the goal. And if you've got through to the end of the project, where you've got two sides, which one is financially, one's I suppose from a business point of view, kick goals, then you've done really, really well. And I suppose it brings into this field the concept of intelligent contract management. And that's that allows you intelligent contract management. It allows you to go through to manage that contract, and there's activities in there systematically and efficiently, and ultimately giving you that operational and financial performance that you're after. And at the same time, it's going to go through and it's going to be minimising risk, because from your point of view, and safety, and these other, from all areas, there's risk, and that risk needs to be managed and minimised. And if you can go through the life of a project and achieve that operational financial performance, and at the same time minimising risk, and that's intelligent contract management, you've done well. I want to talk about the contract process, particularly for a project, and look at that sequence of events, just to, I suppose, put us all on the same level in understanding of how a project goes about from conception right through to project completion. Now, there are many other steps along the way. I've just tried to generalize this process and put some of the key ones in there that are relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. And so obviously I've mentioned the first one, that conception. Someone comes up with the idea, and then you start going through that design process where people will start planning, designing, and coming up with whatever the project is, be it a road, linear infrastructure, or an energy project, whatever it might be. But to go through, and they're going to start designing that. You can get that project description that's going to be starting to be formulated, and you get input from all of the different areas. Then you're going to go through that approval preparation, your permits acquisition phase, where from an environmental point of view, that's when you start really having a lot of involvement, putting together management plans and submitting applications for various approvals, and EIS maybe, well, whatever it would be. But you'll be going through development of that and heavily leaning upon your counterparts within the design and engineering teams, construction teams, and pulling that information in to assist in that the documentation preparation. Then once you go through and you start, and often it's concurrently, but this process needs to be completed, that approvals, you need all of those approvals before you actually get into the completion of the next phase of that contract documentation preparation. And that is when you get, ultimately you go through, you develop those, and you need to have your approvals in that tender, that call to tender process. And I can't stress that enough. That's absolutely paramount. You will end up in a lot of heartache if you haven't got your approvals and conditions for those approvals, and correspondence from regulators, etc. If you don't have that information, all of those commitments and obligations that you've got, if you don't have them in that tender, then you're setting yourself up for a low level of environmental performance. It will be difficult. And if you want to get that higher level of environmental performance, it will cost you a lot of money if you don't have that stuff included in that tender when right up front. And it's only fair, the contractor has to be able to price for that. They need to see what is required, and you can't price for something if you don't know what's required. Particularly when it's in a competitive environment, such as a tender, where you've got other competitors out there who are bidding for a project as well, and they're only going to be pricing off what they've been given, simply what's been provided in that tender. So you need to make sure you've got all those awards, those approvals included in that tender process. So you'll go through, you'll assess those tenders, and you'll go through a contract award and engage a contractor, and then it moves into the phase of the contractor they then have to go through and develop all of that documentation, which is going to then satisfy and complement the documentation that the proponent has put together. And in there are documents we'll talk about later, the Construction Environmental Management Plan, the CEMP, has a major component in there, and there's a lot of other documents that can go and sit in with and underneath that document. But they will have to go through and prepare that and then submit it into the proponent. And there's a very important step. You must specify that CEMP, as I said before, Construction Environmental Management Plan, that document must come in and be reviewed and approved prior to any construction starting, prior to your contract execution process. Because I can guarantee you that if that document hasn't come to you and you've assessed it and thought, yes, that's satisfactory, it complements our documentation. It satisfies the requirements of any licenses, and so now we look at the whole package. We're ready to go. I can see that the contractors committing to providing these resources and these different measures. If you can't see that, approve that prior to commencement of construction, you're never going to see it. And that's just a fact of life. So it's absolutely paramount that that document comes in, it goes through the several iterations, review, oh, hang on, what about this? Goes and comes back. It's absolutely paramount that happens and occurs then and there prior to the next phase of contract execution. That's everything goes ahead and it quickly moves into the contract management phase, where you're actually living that contract, going through and executing everything within that contract, getting the performance that you need. You're providing the deliverables, meeting the spec, and performing as you need, and then ultimately you'll go right through and get to the contract completion, wrap everything up, hand over the documents, and sign it all off, pay the last dollar, hopefully shake hands and go on to the next project. But that's a very, very broad, but more or less that is the process that I will be referring to for the rest of this presentation, and it can vary slightly, but that's pretty much in a nutshell, from my experience, the way in which projects will and generally end up rolling out. Now, I talked a little bit before on the previous slide about the inclusion of approvals, and I wanted to just expand upon that. And I stressed before that they must be included in that contract and or environmental spec, and particularly your environmental specification. But within that contract and within that tender, you've got to give the contractor an opportunity to go about the pricing of that. If you turn up on a project and in looking at that, that hasn't happened yet, the approvals either haven't come through, or say in this case the approvals have come through, but they haven't been included into that contract or into that tender process as yet, you need to get them in there. And so getting it, particularly if you have the opportunity while tenders are still within that competitive bidding environment, then get it in there as soon as you can. However, if that opportunity has passed, then you need to look at coming up with an agreement. Then it needs to be made immediately, almost, but you need to go through that, sit down, go over responsibilities, and come up with an agreement on each condition, each requirement within within all of those conditions that you might have been given as part of your regulatory approval process. Come up and clearly articulate in there whose responsibility each of them are. And been on a project where that didn't happen, and that hurt. And I was on a project as well where we did have to do that, and we sat down and we went, number one, that's you, number two, that's me, number three, etc. And so we sort of went through that, and it makes life so much easier now. But ultimately, if you don't do that, you will leave yourself open to a situation where, and I've got there on the slide, extortionate costs, and it pretty much it can be like that, because the contractor may not be obligated to go ahead and do those things, but you still need to do them, and you'll be in a situation where your contract manager or construction manager, they won't have a lot of opportunity to go out again to go and bring in the resources to go ahead and do that stuff. You'll be left having to use the resources that are there on the ground under the current contract, and you'll find that when you're involved in a large contract like that, the hourly rate for variations and extra work that needs to be done outside of the scope of work, then it will be a lot more. That's by nature. That's where contractors make their money. When they're on site, they're available to do the work, and their price for that work that's outside of that scope of work is a lot more than what it would be in other locations. But I won't go into that. But just trust me, that's just the way it is, and it's not uncommon. We've come to the environmental specification. The content of that environmental specification, it'll vary depending on the project that you've got on. However, you want to be able to try and include the majority of this information that's in there. In your environmental specification, you need to refer to the relevant legislation that is applicable to you on that project. Notify contractors of those bits of legislation so they can refer to them and they can come back and work within them. You're going to cover responsibilities for both parties, be it who's going to be providing which documents, who's going to be going and acquiring which approvals, because you're not going to have every approval at the time of contract award. And I know I've said you've got to have all your approvals in there. You've got to have all of the major approvals in there, but you're not going to get every approval in there. And some of the approvals will be the responsibility of the contractor. And this document is where that needs to be specified. For example, if it was a waterway barrier works permit or a Nature Conservation Act approval to go and clear a certain listed tree or whatever it might be, you need to specify that those permits and approvals are the responsibility of the contractor. Because if that project gets held up because of those, then you don't want to be left responsible for that. And the contractor is the one who's going to be able to detail in there what measures they're going to apply, how they're going to go about doing that work, be it in the waterway, for the waterway barrier works permit, for example. The contractor is going to be able to go in there and they are going to have the information on how they're going to cross it. For as far as the proponent goes, the proponent doesn't have that information. And likewise with the clearing of trees under the Nature Conservation Act, there might be certain measures that they might be able to sneak around the outside. They may not be able to. The contractor may be able to do other things in there to minimise impacts. Those things are all information that they are going to be able to put forward and that they need to have ownership of through that process. So you're going to specify within this document who's going to go and acquire those permits. We'll move to the next one. We'll look at the different management plans that are applicable, and so you'll refer to them so that the contractors are aware that they're going to be working within the parameters of a significant species management plan or a waterways management plan or aquatic values management plan or whatever management plan or approval there may be. You need to be referring to them. The obvious one that you might be referring to might be the EIS and the Environmental Management Plan, those documents, but there's any other documents that are applicable as well. You need to be referring to them within the environmental specification. Give a broad outline, what's covered in this document, and then go ahead and refer them to those documents and provide those documents as part of that tender package. If there are any specific kind of deliverables that are required through this process, these things we want to and need to be included in there. When you get to X waterway or when you get to this boundary, you need to wash down equipment for weeds, or you need to go about and employ any other measures. All of those things need to be very clearly articulated and documented within the specification. Key personnel, the environmental management manager who will sit in there. You want to be able to specify who's going to be there, how, or not saying who exactly, but what qualifications, what experience that person's going to have. And you can even specify in there that that person must be approved by the proponent. And you can even specify that the proponent has the ability to remove that person and request that someone else comes in and takes their place if they're not performing to an adequate level. Those sorts of things can be specified within there. You can also specify what size teams, how many enviros need to be on the project and running around, or whether you need to have specialists within the teams at certain times. For example, acid sulfate soil specialists, or spotter catchers, botanists, ecologists, soil specialists, etc. You can specify the qualifications and experience of all the different people that need to be involved in that project, so that you can get that environmental performance that you need on your project. Within there, you might be talking about the different standards that you're going to be operating to, and documents that you can refer to within there may be the ICA guidelines for soil erosion and sediment control. They could be for example, if it was a gas pipeline or a pipeline, then there is an industry guideline on for environmental management for pipeline construction. And there's a whole heap of other documents and that sort of thing. So you can specify in there that there are certain standards that you want to be achieving from an environmental point of view. You'll also be looking at the documentation that might be required from the contractor, looking at what timeframes need to be applied to the submission of those, when they need to be submitted by, and you can say how long prior to a certain milestone, or the commencement date, or getting to this point, whatever it might be. You can specify that, and that a 2-week turnaround time for review may be involved. So you can talk about all of those sorts of commitments. You say that you as the proponent get an opportunity to be able to go through and assess these things within the right amount of time, and on the other side from the contractor, the contractor can look at that and think, okay, then we submit that on this date, knowing that we're not going to get a decision for another 2 weeks, or whatever it might be specified within this document. So training's another really, really important thing to sort of talk about. What standards of training are going to be involved, and what training will be involved on that project. Have an opportunity to review that training and to make sure that the right information is being conveyed across to the workforce. So you have opportunity to have input into that to make sure that you're going to achieve that maximum performance throughout the project. As I've said before, this whole process, including all of this information and providing this, enables that contractor or the contractors to, in that tender phase, to be able to very fairly price that job. And that's to be out for them. They're going to be able to prepare, price it accordingly, and then for the length of the project, then they will have a budget that they can work towards, and they know that there was a certain amount allocated towards this level of performance from an environmental point of view, and that makes the job of the enviro from the contractor's point of view much easier. Approvals needs to talk about who's going to be getting them and who's responsible for them, and who there might be certain conditions within there that need to be complied with. Who is going to be that responsible entity that's going to be going through and complying with those different obligations and conditions within those requirements set out by the government. Monitoring protocols, parameters. Okay, so monitoring is a major factor from an enviro point of view, getting into your construction and going through that project execution phase. Like you'll have inspections out there, inspectors, enviro officers, advisors, out there, and they will be on site every day, more than likely, hopefully, um, and going through and inspecting and making sure that performance is adequate and as required. But you'll also need to go through and do inspections, and inspections for compliance, and inspections looking at KPIs and that level of performance. And they are a little bit more formal, and they feed back into that contract process, and they'll end up going to, that information from those inspections might end up back on the environmental issues register, and then that information goes and feeds back up into contract meetings, which may be a monthly exercise, and then it enables that performance management to be able to occur at that higher level within the management team. But you really want to be able to clearly articulate how this monitoring process and program is going to be conducted throughout the project. Auditing is another thing which is separate to monitoring. Auditing, you may have requirements in there and provisions within the contract for internal auditing. So to go and occasionally audit the contractor to make sure their systems are in accordance with the way they're meant to be. But then also you might have provisions in there for external audits as well, if the regulator or someone else may have a requirement for that sort of a thing to occur. You could even just have a third-party audit going on for the sake of your the standard that you're complying with from an ISO 14001 point of view. Anyway, there's a lot of different reasons there. Reporting requirements, be it reporting that from the contractor that needs to come back into the proponent, what information is going to be reported on, and that sort of comes down to all of these KPIs, and the management of performance, management of non-conformance. And I'll just digress a little bit. I'm using the word conformance as and compliance, but I want to just sort of differentiate between the two there. Conformance refers to whether things are satisfactory or not within that contract. And so you'll have a conformance or a non-conformance, and that's referring to a contractual matter as opposed to a compliance issue or matter, and that's referring to more of a legislative or a license matter. And so it's you might find those two words get interchanged and used differently, but it's very important to have a good, clear separation between those two, because you may have things from a conformance point of view, things will go wrong, but you'll have systems within that contract, within your project, that will manage different issues. And it's only when those different things, when you have an incident that can't be managed within the system of that project, that it becomes an issue of compliance. Hold points. Hold points are something it's a terminology that's used by a quality engineer, and but sits very much within a contract, and it's a hold point is I'll use a bit of a definition here, a mandatory verification point beyond which the work cannot proceed without an approval, generally from an approval from the proponent. So it may be a case of a classic hold point is the commencement of work. The work can't commence on that project until all the necessary documentation has been provided, and the proponent can go through and say, okay, tick, yeah, we've got that approval, we've closed that one out, we've managed that, we've got this in place, we are ready to work. And that is a hold point, and then that'll come through or an example of a hold point. And so from the contract management point of view, you'll look at it. Each discipline can tick it off and say, from a safety, from a lands, from an engineering, from a construction, from an environment point of view, I'm happy. All the necessary measures are in place. We are ready to go, and construction can start. And it sort of, you go through, you have a lot more of them from an engineering point of view, looking at specification within there, but you want to consider having one or two or a couple of those hold points with particular items. And a great example that I have is with regards to erosion and sediment control. And a requirement that we had on the project was that for each area there needed to be a certified erosion and sediment control plan that had been prepared and certified by a certified practitioner of erosion and sediment control. And we got to a certain location on this project, and it was a very, very steep decline and highly susceptible to erosion. And that project did not have a hold point or hadn't specified that within the project. And so the contractor, even though they were required to provide that information, that certified plan before commencing work, didn't provide that certified plan before going ahead and commencing work in that particular area. And it has ended up being quite a debacle, and I think everyone will be managing that area for a long time in the future. It is very important to get that all of that information through, because once construction starts going, it's very, very hard to stop it. Okay, the construction environmental management plan, we touched on that before, but this information that needs to be contained within that document has to be specified within the environmental specification. You want to really thoroughly cover that, and then also at the end of the project and throughout the project as well, but particularly at the end, the contractor is going to have possession of a lot of data and a lot of information that needs to be transferred back across into the ownership of the proponent. And so how that information comes across, be it GIS data, be it compliance data and recording, and sort of all the other information that's collected along the way, that information has to be transferred back across. And so this is a great document to be able to specify in what format that information needs to be provided, and how, and to what quality, to what spec, how it's to be presented, all of those sorts of things. The more information you can provide in this document, and especially the easier your life will be whenever you get to a phase such as that, handing that data back across. Within the contract and within the environmental specification, there needs to be a small area which is going to define the order of precedence. And that is it's a hierarchical list which goes through and defines which documents will have more power or more authority over another one in the event that there is a contradiction. So legislation and regulatory approvals and regulatory approval conditions, they stand above everything else. There's nothing of a greater hierarchical weight than this document, other than these documents. Then it'll move down to government approved documents, so documents that you or the company has developed and submitted, such as the EIS, EMP, SIMP, other documents which need to be submitted for review by the government and approval. Next down that hierarchy sits the contract and the specification. Those documents will sit in there between your government approved documents and the company management plans. So these are management plans now are the internal documents that may have been developed for the execution of the plan. The company will also have a health and safety environment management plan. Then there will be standards. So they're standards that have been issued, either an Australian standard, international standards. Those documents sit above guidelines, and then those guidelines will all define the general best way of going about doing things, but they're not necessarily applicable in all situations, and so therefore they sit there. Then contractor management plans, contractor management plans will sit below that on the bottom. For a bit of clarity, I just want to talk very briefly about the environmental management plan, the EMP, versus the construction environmental management plan, the CEMP, and they're two different documents. The EMP is a document that's put together by the proponent, and it's a product. It's something that falls out of the EIS. It's probably it's one of the major, from a construction point of view, one of the major items that's delivered out of the EIS. It is the document that gives you all of the mitigation measures and management processes for the project. It'll talk very briefly, generally, about what might be there, the values and the impacts, but its focus is, I suppose, it's more of an operational delivery of the mitigation measures that have been identified all the way through the EIS as part of that risk assessment. So it provides the commitments on how, well, more it's the commitment that the erosion and or the soil will be managed appropriately. Erosion and sediment control measures will be installed. It provides commitments that the water will be managed accordingly. Flora and fauna. It talks about general management measures for the construction process or whatever process you're going through. However, it sort of provides, this is what we're going to do. This is, we're going to manage these different things. We'll have a system in place and we'll manage these different things. That document goes into the tender spec, or as part of it's referred to within your environmental specification, and the construction environmental management plan, on the other hand, is a document that is in response to the environmental management plan. That the CEMP is put together by the contractor, and it's more nuts and bolts. It's in more detail. When I say nuts and bolts, it's more detail on how these measures are actually going to be implemented, and it will have diagrams, or should have diagrams, and it should refer to the environmental, also the erosion and sediment control plans, the certified ones, and it should refer to any other measures, waterway crossings and or processes. Refer to your the procedures. So procedures will be even more detailed, but the CEMP will refer to those procedures and talk about how those measures, the commitments that have been made in the EMP, it'll talk about how the contractor is actually going to meet those measures within there. And sort of a very simplified example that I use on site would be that the construction environmental management plan sort of defines how they're going to dig that hole. They're going to pick up that shovel. They're going to put their foot on the shovel and they're going to push it into the ground and lift it out. It doesn't need a contractor's environmental management plan. Doesn't need and doesn't want to go about specifying exactly which machine is going to go and dig that hole, because the contractor needs to have a bit of flexibility as to, we don't have that machine available today, we'll use this machine over here, and it does just exactly the same job, it's just a bit faster or slower. But it needs to talk about how it's going to, in doing that process, how it's going to manage the risks that might be presented by that process. And so in doing that, the CEMP then becomes a major tool from the proponent's point of view to manage that contract, because the CEMP becomes a contract document. And for example, let's use the example of a waterway crossing where you might be cutting open a waterway and going and building and constructing and going through a water course, and so that CEMP is going to detail the planning processes that'll go into place and what documents will be prepared in that planning process. It'll talk about what methodologies might be available in that construction process, talk about what standards and what results will be achieved through that process. And so give the proponent an opportunity to look at that and think, okay, that's going to meet our obligations, and so I'm happy, I'm satisfied with that. Or they can provide comment on there and say, well, look, I'm not totally clear on what's going to go on here. Can you provide more information? And so it enables that dialogue to go back and forth between the contractor and the proponent to be able to come up so that both organisations have a good, thorough understanding of what's going on. It also provides the opportunity for the environmental manager or the enviro within the contractor to be able to go through and plan these things out prior to getting there, and ensure that they have the resources, talk with their management and within their organisation to say, okay, these are the obligations that we've got to meet over here. This is my plan, and do I have these resources available? Can we commit to doing these sorts of things? So it enables a good appreciation process up front. That planning phase, from their point of view, enables them to go through that and plan and know that, okay, I've got the resources, I can achieve the performance that I want to achieve and that the client wants to achieve, and the stakeholders, the landowners, and everyone else around us, the regulator. We can achieve those sorts of things. So the CEMP becomes a really, really important document, and a lot of attention needs to go into it in the development of that, and you'll become very familiar with working with them. So the CEMP that I've talked about in the previous slide, it's prepared by the contractor for a couple of specific reasons, and I have touched on those, but providing that assurance to the proponent on what aspects are going to be managed and how they're going to be managed, and it also enables everyone to make sure it ties in, meshes with that project environmental management plan. And as I mentioned before, it's a critical contract document that's going to be sitting in there that you refer to all the time. It empowers the contractors' enviro, enables them to go through that full appreciation process, get resources, discuss options, plan for different things. They need to be going through, and in there some really important things to be identifying. It gives the contractor an opportunity to specify what lead and lag, whether they want to put both lead and lag in there, great if they do, but what KPIs are going to be used in there, and what KPIs they'll be working to, and so it gives an opportunity for them to be specified within there, and something that became, I suppose, apparent to me on the last couple of projects that I was involved in. It allows or gives that opportunity for the system to be really clearly articulated so that someone can look at that system and be assured that if that system's followed, then the necessary levels of compliance will be achieved. Now, I'll give you an example of what I'm referring to there, a simplified one, but let's say we're constructing, we're doing some work, and we're working beside a creek, and the legislation states that no contaminant can be released to water. And so there's nothing wrong with going and placing your drum of oil right next to the creek. And you can sit it there happily. You could even sit it in a bund and sit it right next to the creek. There's no oil has been released to waters. So as far as compliance goes, there's no problem yet. There's only a problem when that oil actually gets tipped into the waterway. But obviously, when that happens, then it's too late. The oil is in the water, and now you've got a big problem on your hands. um, as opposed to monitoring whether there is oil in the creek or not, which, if we look at that, it's a lag indicator. It's okay, we don't have oil in the creek, great. We don't have oil in the creek, great. We do have oil in the creek, now that's terrible. So as opposed to doing that, you want to set in place, and this is the job of the CEMP, set in place a plan that's going to prevent that oil from going into the water. And so ultimately, if one of those steps, let's say there's a 5-step plan that you're going to store the oil away from the creek, you're going to store it in a bund, you're going to keep spill response gear with it, you're going to have all of these different steps in that process. And so if some of these steps have been omitted, for example, it's there might be the bund, there might be the spill kit, there might be some training to go with it, etc., etc. However, it's sitting right next to the bank of the creek. You know that there's a shortcut being taken in this process. Let's rectify that problem now before we simply have someone's ute back into it and tip it over and put it into the creek. And so they're the sort of systems that you really want to look at having in this CEMP. Put the process in there so that you can manage your levels of compliance and manage your levels of environmental performance. Because managing things in accordance with lag indicators, such as, is oil in the creek? Yes. Well, then, too late, is a very, very poor way, very inefficient way, very ineffective way of managing environmental performance. Think of it from a lead indicator point of view. You've got that 5-step process in place beforehand. Monitor those 5 steps. That's what you want to be looking at and going and checking each week. Go out there on site and go, okay, good. You've got it sitting 50 metres from the creek. You've got it in a bund. You've got it with the spill gear, and everyone's been trained. Wonderful, happy days. So think about those sorts of things when putting together a CEMP, or if you're reviewing the CEMP, think about those things to see, is there a system in place that I can monitor here? I don't want to be monitoring straight compliance. Communication is a really important thing with effective contract management and effective environmental management. And it's something that you really need to make sure. If you're in the position of putting together a team, you want to get a team of good communicators, because it ultimately can, it really sets the culture within your team, which then has a very strong influence on how you're going to go about working together, and ultimately that impacts on your environmental performance and what sort of level of performance you can get. However, looking at a contract generally, and again, I'm talking from a generalised point of view, we'll go straight to the chase. Email and even direct communication over the phone or talking, that it is not considered, generally not considered, an authorised form of communication under a contract. And so what I mean by that is communication within a contract will have set pathways or set processes that it has to go through. Either a letter, a contract letter needs to be written, and that forms, it's documented, and it's been it's authorised, etc., and it's gone through the correct pathways under that contract. That is an example of an authorised form of communication under a contract. And so when I'm talking about that sort of communication, the sort of communication that we're talking about there is be it an instruction that when you get to this location, you need to, or when you get to that creek, you need to hold off on the clearing for 5 days, or wait until this next process, wait until you've prepared everything either side of that creek, and then once that's been prepared, then you can go ahead clearing in that creek, for example, or sort of any variations, any specific details that need to be communicated. They all need to be in one of the following forms of communication. And that would be, it'd be in a minuted meeting, so a meeting held between the contractor and the proponent, where you go about, and it's minuted, and it can go back, and then that correspondence, can be agreed upon. As I mentioned before, contract letter. They're an authorised person under that contract. They can give that directive, and then documented at a later point in time. And that, look, a contract can have other ways. You may have a site instruction. You can have a whole heap of other forms of communication that may be recognised under that contract, and that's up to the contract manager to come up with all of those wonderful methods. But I wanted to just let everyone know here that an email, for example, sending it across to your counterpart on the other side of, when you get to this location over here, can you please do X, Y, and Z, is not a good form of contract communication, and nor is it really recognised. It needs to go through the correct pathways. Monitoring performance, and specifically when we're talking about monitoring, on-site monitoring, going and doing a site inspection with your counterpart, and that sort of a thing. Now, within the, as mentioned earlier on, within the environmental specification, and possibly an environmental management plan, but definitely a spec, you want to be specifying the times and which personnel are going to be going out and doing that monitoring. So, with that in mind, you have got options, and you can talk about, there are several different types, several different forms of monitoring, of which I'd probably recommend the bottom one. They're the combination of all three above it. But so look, direct monitoring, I'll just explain these a little bit more. Direct monitoring is with the proponent being out on site, walking along with the contractor and looking at these specific issues on site, going along, okay, yeah, good, that's been installed correctly, that's looking good result occurring over here. This isn't as good as it could be. Let's look at coming up with a better solution. What can be done here? What do you suggest? So that's your direct monitoring, going through and reporting that. You can go through the process of devolved monitoring to the contractor. I've seen a little bit of this done with less result. It's a cheaper option from the proponent's point of view. I generally find that you don't quite get the same level of performance. However, that all comes down to how that contract is written, and if you've got very clear performance levels, KPIs, standards within there, then this is something that you could very well do, and have the contractor go about doing their own monitoring and reporting it and sending that information back up. And the third one in there is an independent third-party monitoring, someone such as a superintendent or that sort of person who may be on site, and they or an enviro, third-party enviro out there, could even be a regulator, and I've seen that done on jobs too, have a regulator, dedicated individual out on a site and work effectively. But having a separate party out there doing that monitoring, that's quite a valid and an effective way of doing it. But if you can get to a point where you've got a combo, I would say, so most of the time, if you can get that direct monitoring, that's a very good result. And then you sort of mix it up a little bit, have requirements in your spec for that, for the contractor to do their own, and then also occasionally that third party to come in, monitor a few things, best result. And the more monitoring you do, obviously, the better the management. It's like the old saying of you can't manage what you don't measure, and if you're out there measuring and monitoring and doing that sort of a thing, you're going to be able to manage better performance. So get out there, monitor, and document. It's not a matter of walking on site and sort of kicking the dust together and saying, oh, that looks good, that looks not good. You want to be on site and you want to be documenting this stuff and recording, are KPIs being met, and then coming up with a resolution for that. Okay, that KPI hasn't been met. How are you going to meet that? When will you meet it by? Who's the responsible person for making sure that's fixed by that time, etc. KPIs are a tool that you're going to use on site to measure your performance. A very simple example would be the speedo on a car, and you choose the speed of 60 as the speed limit, and you can look down and you can see at any moment whether you are performing appropriately, you're under the speed limit, or whether you're performing inappropriately and going above that speed limit. And likewise, from an environmental point of view, you can set yourself different KPIs on site, but they need to be clear, and they need to be things that you can that aren't open for interpretation and can be read in different ways. They need to be things that, for example, a lead indicator that you might use on there might be you're going to conduct weekly inspections or four inspections a month, and go through that. And if you're doing that, you're thinking, yeah, we're going to be at least monitoring all of this process and getting what we need. Then also a lag indicator that you might want to use on there could be with regards to your water that you're releasing on site, having that remain below that 50 milligrams per litre of suspended solids on site. KPIs need to be specific, and you need to be able to really detail that level of performance of how to go about the satisfaction of them. As I said before, they can't be ambiguous. They need to be really clear and specific. They need to be measurable. The last point, it sits around the topic of KPIs, but with the whole concept of reporting. Now, I like to encourage as much reporting on site in my project, sort of wherever at work. I want to encourage anything and everything to be reported. Don't use a number of incidents, for example. We'll only have 2 incidents this month as a KPI, because when the third incident happens, what are people going to do? That incident didn't really occur. Let's not report it. There we go. We've met our KPI. We've only had 2 incidents this month. That is a very poor indicator. And so I see a healthy system as one that's got a lot of reports in it, a lot of incidents. And we all know that on a construction site, and you'll learn that you will always have incidents occurring on site. And if someone says, we haven't had an incident here for months and months, you know that they're either lying or they aren't reporting properly, because there are incidents occurring every day. And you want to encourage that reporting culture and get so everything is coming up. Don't penalise anyone for reporting things. Look at your system and look at how you can set up KPIs based on things other than numbers of reports coming in, because you don't want to discourage that reporting process. And that is a really important point. Okay, through your career, I'm sure you're going to end up in a situation where the performance isn't as good as you would like it. Managing poor performance and managing it well is a skill. And if there's any one particular skill in this whole process, that once things start turning pear-shaped, communication, I can't speak highly enough of it. You need to increase your communication, and it needs to be amicable. It needs to be positive. It needs to be proactive. Own the problem. Because if there's a poor environmental performance somewhere, yes, old mate might have just decided to go on his own and do whatever. However, if you own it, you can look at it and think, well, maybe we should have trained better. Maybe we should have had better systems in place, because you want to develop a system and learn from this whole thing. No point in just blaming old mate over there on the excavator, or this, the woman over there driving the truck, or whatever the problem might have been. You sort of need to look at, okay, things go wrong. How can I go about changing this culture, this scenario, the situation, so that we don't have this sort of thing occurring again? But when you're in the midst of it and you think, oh, look at this, why has that occurred? What can I do? How can we fix it? How am I going to get them to fix it? you need to increase your communication, and you need more meetings. You need to look at reviews. You need to look at sort of, let's discuss what is the issue at hand. Was it clearly articulated, that level of performance that was required? And again, yes, it was. Okay, then now why? What fell down in the system? Okay, I need you to provide me with an updated system that fills that hole, doesn't let anything get through there again. Now, it doesn't necessarily always happen that easily, and so that's why you need to, when you're doing that planning process and looking at developing that environmental specification, you get these problem-solving mechanisms and dispute resolution processes and within a documented system, so that when something goes wrong, this is how you're going to resolve it. That doesn't always work, so and that's why you sort of need to have more hard line terms specified within the contract. At what point would legal action be required? And then obviously sort of later on down the track, you need to look at options for termination, be it penalties or be it removal of scope from the contractor and giving it over here. And you need to set those mechanisms up in place. Sort of when you get to that situation and you think, oh, we need to go and find another contractor to come in and fix that hole or resolve that problem, whatever it is there. It's a long process if you have to go through that procurement process to think, oh, okay, well, it's over this amount. I need to go and get 3 quotes. Now I need to go to tender, or now I need to try and find a contractor who can come in. Have all that stuff organised right up front. Look at it, plan for it in that contract, but have it all articulated in there so that you know, okay, that's been triggered. Okay, we all knew that was coming. It was in black and white right in front of us. Now I have no option but to go ahead and execute clause X. In the situation where a lesser than optimal level of performance has been identified, one of the critical things there is to make sure that there's an immediate notification that goes across from both sides of the contract, be it the contractor to the proponent, to go through and let them know, okay, there's been an issue here, we haven't performed as we wanted to, and we've got these measures that are getting put in place to try and rectify the problem. Or conversely, on the other side, the proponent needs to be able to notify the contractor immediately so that they can, so they don't get too far down the track, or so that they don't think that, oh, well, it was okay last time, we'll do it again over here. You need to let them know immediately that, okay, there's been a substandard area of performance over here, and we need to go about finding a suitable resolution for that. So there may be a level of a formal notification going in that process, and it just depends on the relationship, and it depends on how everyone's working and what mechanisms you've got in place in that contract. In the next slide, we'll look at the environmental issues register as a great tool to go about managing non-conformances. In going about through this process and getting that communication up and identifying better performance indicators, it gives the contractor that opportunity to go about rectifying the problem, and an opportunity for everyone to go and get things the way they're meant to be. Environmental issues register was a tool that we devised on a project to efficiently and effectively encourage and manage environmental performance, and it works very well. The issues register is a great tool to be able to communicate the information of an area where performance isn't as where it probably should be, across to the contractor for them to be able to go about specifying their own way of resolving that problem and communicating a timeline in which they're going to do it, and they can assign a responsibility to it. It's a great tool, and then you can monitor the closeout of that. It's a document that's very effective in the management of these issues, and you go right through and you end up with hundreds of things on there. And it's a healthy system if you have hundreds of items on there, because it shows that you are managing your issues on site effectively to get the performance. Now, one of the KPIs, I'll sort of give you a little bit of insight. One of the KPIs that we had on one of the projects where we were using this was that the issues identified on there would all be closed out within the specified timeframes, and it was great. In talking about performance and environmental performance on site, an important thing to put into the back of your mind in case the event occurs is what to do in the event of a breach of legislation. And an example that we will talk about clearing occurring outside of our boundaries. It may be the release of water with a higher level of suspended solids. It could be all manner of things, breach of license condition. However, it's important to remember that what your role is in this situation. Your role on site is to report and to advise. So in the event that there is a breach, and let's use the example of you've turned up on site and there's a dozer just starting to clear outside of its permitted boundary, you've got a few responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is to report back up to your project manager, and you need to advise. And in this case, if there's a breach of legislation or license condition, then you need to advise them that they've got to stop. In most cases, you'll have your project manager will advise back and say, right, go and talk with the guys on site, convey that information, talk with the guys on site and inform them to stop that work in that area, bring the machines out of that area and go and either come up with a way of remediating or fixing that issue, commencing that, or in the event if it's caused some serious damage, then you'll need to look at going away and devising a plan to come back and rectify that problem. Now, at the same time, you're under the Environmental Protection Act, and also more than likely underneath your environmental authority and other licenses that you'll have a responsibility where there is a breach of a license condition or a breach of legislation, then that needs to be reported to the regulator. And generally, your license will give conditions on how to go about doing that. If not, then there is the pollution hotline within Queensland. There are other numbers within other states and areas, but you can go through notifying the regulator. And I need to stress there as well that communicating with the regulator and informing them of these things puts them on side, keeps the level of communication going, and it creates a team where you can go about going and rectifying problems. If a regulator was to turn up on site and find out that there are certain breaches that have been sort of brushed under the carpet or hidden or that sort of a thing, then they're going to take a totally different view upon that issue, as opposed to if they've been advised, oh look, we've had an issue, we've put a measure in place to prevent that from occurring again, and we're going about remediating, etc. There's going to be a much higher level of trust that's going to exist between the two organisations. Righto guys, thanks for listening to this module on environmental performance, and I hope you can take a few of these things away and apply them on a project in the future, and to really go about getting the performance that you need and that you want on your project.